Darkwood was released on August 17th, 2017. It was created by a tiny indie outfit named Acid Wizard Studios. It was well received by critics, players, as well as whatever the hell I am, and has subsequently developed a tiny but devoted fanbase of loyal weirdos. Darkwood is one of those games that kind of many have played, but very few have ever finished. 5 years or so after its release, it's largely considered a cult classic, or at least on its way to obtaining that dubious and often misapplied title. It's usually described as a Frankenstein's monster comprised of the juiciest bits of Silent Hill, Stalker, and The Forest. Or something like that.
Thanks, everybody. But I couldn't have done all this without the help of my brainy sister Eliza.
Because we live in some kind of post-art dystopia, where everything new is just an amalgam of various products made in a mythic before time. Before the internet rotted everyone's brain, when the fruit of people's unique ideas roamed the landscape, chucking children down wells for the entertainment of the rest of us. Anyway, I've even heard Stardew Valley used as a comparison by people of, let's say, dubious psychological stability. The achievement for finishing the prologue currently stands at 72.3%. Less than 30% of players earn one of the 3 achievements you can earn next, which is about halfway through the first chapter of the game. So why does a game with this startling lack of player retention still have such a glowing reputation amongst survival horror fans? Because even if you only make it halfway through the first night before bailing, like sticking one's hand unprotected into a nest of black widows, it's already made quite an impression on the player. That's what happened to me, at least. Not the Black Widows. I bounced off this game twice before making it through, and both times I came away feeling like it was probably an exceptional survival horror game, just one I didn't have the courage or patience for at the time. And just because I'm too much of a wuss to get far doesn't mean it's achieved anything less. I'm the problem here, the game's just surprisingly good at what it does, which is scaring various bodily substances out of people. In the horror genre, games included, scaring people off can be seen as a badge of honor. Kind of like how an addict will hear about someone ODing and run straight to whatever pusher sold the fatal shot. People falling off just means they're putting out a damn good bag that mustn't be missed. Despite falling off regarding Darkwood, I always thought of it as a good game that I would eventually return to. I felt this so strongly that it remained installed on my PC for years, awaiting the day I'd return and subject myself to its charms once again. I wasn't wrong, and now here we are. The prologue introduces the main antagonist for the first half of the game, a paranoid doctor who's implied to have initially tried to help and then later experimented on the villagers and other survivors of the forest during the outset of the Wood Plague, which will be covered in more depth later. He states that the villagers both hate and fear him, and they may well have good reason. He has several large cages in his house that he states are empty for now. He has also imprisoned a man in an adjacent locked room. His treatment of the villagers and subsequent shunning has left him alienated to such a degree that he's begun to go mad with hatred and loneliness. Isolation and alienation are major themes here, and the Doctor is the first of many characters we meet who have been subjected to mind-breaking levels of separation from anything kind or bright or friendly. Their worlds have become isolated little pockets of perpetual darkness and fear. These pockets brush up against one another occasionally, whether to trade or perhaps set up a different kind of deal, but the ever-present fear keeps them separated from any real attachment, keeps them alone. Anyone you meet is probably going to either go insane or die within the following days, weeks, months, so why form bonds? It's a truly hopeless situation for the Doctor as well. We're initially inclined to sympathize with him, and when we start playing, it's him we control. His perspective we see this world through. He's been there from the start. His own sanity has been digested by the slow progression of the trees, plague, and monstrosities both human and inhuman. He blames the villagers for his involuntary isolation, but it's the forest that truly isolates him, isolates them all. Whatever has caused the forest to go mad is at fault. Everything else is just symptoms, individual falling dominoes. Just one piece out of hundreds that comprise this procession of disparate events that are slowly stitched back together as we play through the game. There are myriad questions from the start. We find the Doctor's tools, which he notes haven't been sterilized in years. But it doesn't matter because the local patients can't be helped. So if they're already beyond help, why is he still capturing and imprisoning them? We have reason to believe that he's infected with the plague. Everything in the region seems to be infected. He says he hears voices in the static of his radio, or sometimes just her voice. As we explore his home, we find relics of a time when he genuinely was trying to help, or at least figure out what was happening. There are medical books with dog-eared pages detailing facial disfigurements that resemble those found on people we meet throughout Darkwood, or at least what the earlier stages might have looked like. Amongst the detritus of this broken life, we locate a key to the front door. We let ourselves out into the world for the first time and are immediately confronted with our first moral choice. Chained up in our path, the doctor's dog is writhing in obvious pain. You choose whether to put it out of its misery or leave it to suffer. After the dog, we head into the forest, which has overgrown every road out of the region, encircling the area with trees that grow quicker than you can chop them down. The proliferation of this prodigious use of, hopefully, photosynthesis has made it impossible to enter or exit. The forest grows so quickly that entire corpses are absorbed by the tangled walls of foliage within a couple of days. As we travel deeper into the forest, we find the corpses of both humans and animals laid out in strange geometric patterns, as if an offering. After scavenging an abandoned house, we come across an unconscious man lying unattended in the forest. He carries nothing but a journal and a mysterious key marked with the number 21. The doctor has never seen him before. He's a stranger, which means he's made it through the impenetrable forest somehow, which means that he must know a way out. He takes the stranger back to the house and presumably injects him with a form of concentrated plague, or maybe it'd be more accurate to call it the essence of the wood itself, a concoction we're to become very familiar with in the next few weeks. This process brings him back from the brink of death and doubtlessly saves his life, but the doctor only wants to interrogate him about the key and the exit. An unknown amount of time passes like this. While the doctor is away, we take control of the stranger, break out of the room, and discover another one of the doctor's prisoners locked in an adjacent room. Instead of conversing, he immediately attacks the player and serves as a bit of much-needed early combat training. After finishing him off, the dying man mocks us, and then the room is flooded with dark, shadowy figures who assault the stranger until he goes down. Morning comes with a cutscene, and we see that we were saved by a mysterious figure who takes us to the first hideout. With this, the first proper day in the world of Darkwood begins. I know it happens to most players around this point, because it happened to me, several times actually. When I had previously bounced off this game, I always made it past the first day and night, the first gameplay loop, and just stopped playing. So what is the gameplay loop of Darkwood like? The first thing to note is that the dominant mechanic is simply the day-night cycle. It's largely familiar territory to anyone who's played a survival crafting game before. You spend the day gathering supplies and nights huddled inside, trying not to attract the attention of monsters. Minecraft uses this formula, so why, used here, does it scare so many people off? Because the nights in Darkwood can be absolutely terrifying, to a degree that no other game, in my experience, has matched. Aha, I hear you say. Well, hear someone say. Dying Light has really scary nights too. Well, I say unto you, you poor, sad, silly, sad, handsome, sad, sexy little man you can do parkour in Dying Light. On the first day, and really many to follow, you slowly amble around, dodging dogs, if you can figure out how to do that, and infected humans called savages, scrounging basic supplies that you can use to craft weapons, healing items, or base defenses. You can barricade windows and doors using the wood and nails you find scattered throughout the landscape, move furniture around to block routes or funnel enemies, build Molotov cocktails, and eventually a variety of firearms, albeit with very limited ammo. But once night comes, especially in the later bases, things will always still get in. Unless you find a way to cheese the system, they will always smash their way in and hunt you down, and they will usually find you. You can kind of Benny Hill them around until daybreak in some of the later and larger bases, but that still involves being one misstep away from a bad death all night, as you desperately try not to box yourself in. Maybe there's a barricade you forgot about that's now blocking your only exit and leads to certain death. Or you run out of your annoyingly limited stamina at the wrong moment. Or maybe you can stay a room away from the things howling for your blood, just long enough to survive and hear the sweetest sound a player of this game can hear. The rising waves of the life-saving Morning Comes music. On the first night, if you're lucky, you've crafted a board with some nails hammered through, but still have zero understanding of the intentionally obtuse combat system. It's seriously hard to even get swings off when you're deep in panic mode in this game. On PC, to attack, you hold the right mouse button to charge the attack, then press the left button to swing. This is reminiscent of games like Silent Hill, that also had intentionally jank controls to accentuate the fact that your character is not good at this. He's not a combat guy. He's just someone that's found himself in an impossible situation. No Spec Ops training for James Sunderland, and no basic ability to swing a stick for you. You better start practicing, because things aren't going to get any easier from here. Until they do, but that's quite a bit later. Darkwood aims to make you feel like you're the one trapped in this hungry forest filled with monsters, and it succeeds to a large extent. It's just that once you're in there, you might find out you don't like it so much and not sign up for Night 2. Who would have guessed it's pretty stressful being trapped in a forest filled with monsters? Of course, it helps to be an actual fan of the survival horror genre. In order to survive, you need to become the scariest monster in the woods, or at least the only thing left in them with a pump-action shotgun. And once you do, it's extremely satisfying. But initially you're just a stranger with a little bit of poop in his pants and a goal: to find the key the doctor stole from you, and zero idea of how to go about doing that. The first task becomes surviving that first night, when you really and truly have no idea what to expect. Even if you've spoiled yourself silly, it's all randomized. What specifically drives the scares here, though? There are a number of culprits, but sound design would be at the top of that list. Say we take a nice pretty calendar and write down the things that happen in the first base, the peaceful meadows. The entries for most nights would amount to heard spooky sounds and maybe stuff moved around. Nothing of real consequence happens here, until it does. But to the new player, sitting next to a flickering lamp, everything around you barricaded, the ground lightly salted with broken glass, and relying solely on your sense of hearing to figure out how screwed you are. You end every night believing the morning barely saved you, because you are definitely about to be swarmed and pulled apart by rabid ghouls. Night is punctuated with intermittent footsteps, whispers, creaks as things test your windows and doors, or just walk past on their way to whatever a feral wood-eating plague victim is up to past 3 a.m. This design leaves you constantly trying to interpret every sound. If there are few sounds, you still can't relax, because you start to constantly imagine sounds. While you're sitting as still as you can in the near dark and listening, your imagination is running wild. And in survival horror games, one thing that you can't see but suspect is there is worth 10 howling monsters chasing after you. This concept of limiting the player's senses to let the imagination fuel the real scares is also accomplished through the retro top-down graphics and aforementioned intentionally awkward combat system. You can't see very far away, even in the midday sun. It's a forest. There are trees and decaying farmhouses and stuff in the way. You have a limited cone of vision and can't see behind you, causing you to snap around every time you hear pretty much anything whatsoever. Sometimes there actually is something there, trying to get the drop on you. Unfortunately for them, the game has rendered you a nervous ball of meat and paranoia, and you're not falling for any more of its tricks. With all the normal ways you interact with a game hampered in some way, the developers let your manga-rotted brain do the heavy lifting, while they save a ton on money and time on not having to try and approximate AAA graphics as a small indie team with a tiny budget. It's also how the greats of the genre operated back in the Resident Evil Silent Hill days. Though back then this strategy was employed because they were extremely limited from a technical standpoint. So sensory deprivation was a double genius move at the time. We've all heard how Silent Hill 2 is foggy because it limited the amount of stuff the ancient hardware had to render. Games like Darkwood prove that it was also just good game design and continues to be more effective at scaring people than a hyper-realistic AAA monster model, slobbering in your face to this day. See the recent, let's say, problematic launch of Callisto Protocol? Another new mechanic we're introduced to is the oven in your hideout. It has the twin purposes of letting you cook down certain biological materials that you inject yourself with in order to level up and gain certain skills, as well as filling the hideout with a special gaseous substance that keeps the worst things the forest has to offer away at night. Wandering too far from your hideout and the influence of this special substance results in a not quite instant death, but this leaves the player feeling even more trapped during the night. If things go sideways, and they absolutely will go sideways eventually, it's not like you can flee and take your chances in the darkness. You must stand and fight, or play a desperate game of hide and seek within your allotted territory. Escape is never truly an option at any point, night or day. The forest always has you. It gets a little more aggressive every night, every time you level up. Every time you move to a different base deeper in the forest. The woods are alive and they play with their food. The whole injecting biological materials thing works like this. As you progress through the game, you will find these big red pulsating shrooms growing in the dark corners of most important story locations, along with the odd meat you get from killing certain enemies, and embryos, which you get from both trading and smashing open these huge, gross cocoons that I'm pretty sure how the woods spawn monsters from the savage's sacrifices. You take these items back to your hideout and use the oven to cook them. As you cook more material, the syringe fills with a bubbling red liquid. Once it's full, you presumably jam it into a vein and press that plunger down. This brings up a kind of level up screen, where you can select various skills depending on how many injections you've had previously. There are 4 tiers of skills, with 3 positive and 2 negative per tier. You have to select 1 negative skill per tier, but yet 2 of the 3 positives. Some of these skills are extremely useful, like Eagle Eye, which lets you see a little bit further and helps a ton with finding locations. The negatives aren't so negative you don't want to level up at all, which is completely possible. Just don't cook any shrooms. The skills aren't so clutch as to be required, unless you're playing on nightmare difficulty or something. In normal mode, you can totally beat the game with 0 skills. The real reason you shouldn't sleep on leveling up is that many of these skills have lore connections, like a high tier ability that lets you eat wood to heal, an ability shared by the savages in the later stages of infection. These skills are really side effects of the concentrated plague juice you keep shooting directly into your veins. Around every other time you level up, you will seemingly overdose and slip into some very interesting dream sequences. These are also really useful in sniffing out some details of the story. I always love it when a game has unique, lore-friendly RPG elements. The final way leveling up affects the game world is how your character appears to others. This never substantially affects gameplay. There are no required main quest style characters that won't interact with you as a result. But these injections are the main cause of your own mutations and deformities. The doctor started you down this path, injecting you with plague and stripping you of the need for traditional food and water. But as you continue more and more, the NPCs you interact with will tell you how inhuman you're beginning to look. It's clear that the more you inject, the more you become like the woods. You start out as a stranger, but by the end of the game, after 8 or so injections, you're little more than another mutated denizen of these cursed lands. Considering your goal is to escape the woods, you start to wonder how that's actually gonna work. You're well beyond anything that could be considered human, and there's likely no place in the real world left for something like you, at least outside of a laboratory, being carved up and studied. If you make it through the first night, there will be a new face waiting for you by the oven in the morning. The famous Wolfman. He greets you only as meat. Like the Doctor, the Wolfman is a creature driven by hatred of the villagers who have shunned him. They hate and fear Wolf. I guess initially because of his looks, later his actions. The stranger, because of the Doctor's injection, has developed his own facial deformities. Because of this, the Wolfman at least seems to feel a kind of kinship with the stranger, and offers a mutually beneficial arrangement if the player can prove himself worthy by making it to the Wolfman's main camp in the next part of the woods, known as the Silent Forest. He's an innately suspicious character from the moment you meet him, exemplified by the fact that he sometimes giggles to himself as he instructs you on your next task, which is universally a bad sign in my eyes. How he knows about you or the key to begin with is unknown, but if you consider it for any length of time, you can't help but think it's possible he knows the Doctor, and is either leading you into a trap or betraying the Doctor for his own benefit. Neither possibility bodes well for your own relationship with this sharp creature. However, getting ahead of ourselves a bit, once you do manage to make it to the second camp, he seems genuinely surprised and impressed, and if pestered for gossip, will open up a little bit. He tells us that the villagers have all kinds of secrets and treasures, and that they mistreat both of you because of your deformities, but it's fine because you're buddies, aren't you? He ends by remarking that the villagers deserve to be punished, and with that, your impending quest becomes even more ominous. He wants you to talk to a woman in the village, one that reeks like chicken. She has something that doesn't belong to her, something Wolf wants. You are to bring him a key to the back room, where she keeps this mysterious thing. He clearly wants to punish the chicken lady somehow. But before we get to the buddy speech in our next assignment, we have to actually make it to a second camp. Wolf comes to your base only on the second morning after the first night you survive on your own. From here on, you'll have to locate him yourself at his various hideouts, one in each biome, scattered throughout the map. Instead of our canine friend, our morning visitor becomes a mostly silent man that is only referred to as the traitor. His face is largely obscured by what looks like large chunks of fungus, but you can see his breath fogging in the morning cold, and the deep dark impressions of his eyes as he awaits whatever business you have for him. He wears thick gloves and is completely silent. The few times that he deems events important enough to engender communication, he does so by writing on himself with a cylindrical piece of charcoal. There are many theories surrounding the traitor, but little actual information is given. The last time you see him alive, the sack he wears slides away, revealing that he reeks of mushrooms and is covered with horrid growths, fusing a helmet to his chest, insinuating that he may have been a soldier or biker or construction worker or a safety-conscious skateboarder, or died on top of a helmet and was fused to it with fungi and resurrected by the woods. The one thing we do know for certain is that he was the one that pulled the stranger out of the Doctor's house when all hope seemed lost, and transported him safely to the first hideout. Despite the mystery surrounding him, he's basically our sole companion for the first chapter of the game, the only other face we see consistently, day after day. Even if you die during the night, he's right there when you wake up the next morning. None of the usual reputation, the currency used here gained for surviving the night, but no worse for wear. He also sells us much needed equipment, using said reputation. Whatever we can't find by scavenging, we can always buy from the trader. He's a lifesaver. As previously mentioned, the only obvious goal in this game is to escape the woods, and the first major task confronting us in this endeavor is to find the key the Doctor took from us. Initially, our only lead is to go find Wolfman in the next area of the game, the Silent Forest. To do this, we have to scavenge and craft, and failing that, purchase enough supplies for the trip. How much is enough supplies? Go see that first loading screen again. You have to guess and then pray it's enough. If you've been extremely lucky or thorough with your scavenging, you might have a shovel or even a pistol by the time you leave the dry meadow. I didn't. I had an upgraded board with a nail through it and some Molotovs. The way exploration in Darkwood works is you explore as much of a chunk of map as you can, hopefully locating a special location filled with loot in the process, then run back to your hideout before night falls and the woods release the Hounds of Hell, as well as the regular type. Hounds of no special affiliation, outside maybe Plague, so Plague Hounds, I guess. Yeah, let's go with that. The next morning you set out again, exploring more of the map and finding horrible things, along with, I guess, necessary things, like wood and nails, bits of cloth and wire, or, if you're lucky, likely expired, loose, unlabeled pills. Stranger's pills. Well, you're a stranger, damn it, so hammer those bad boys down. One heals you, one makes your stamina regenerate faster, and one isn't a pill at all. That's broken glass, baby. Thanks, Acid Wizards. So you do this until you have what you hope is enough crap to go find the Wolfman's second camp, which is helpfully marked on the map. Then make your way through the transition location, which is the first place you're likely to find a stick savage, and upon defeating him, a stick. Or a staff, even, which is what you need to craft a shovel. You can also kill the bugs if you can time an attack right, or light them on fire. These drop shells, which make armor, which is a game changer, especially considering you're heading into the first of two rather dramatic spikes in difficulty the game throws at you. Here's my advice. If you don't have a gun, don't stay in the second hideout yet. The second base shows you how incredibly safe the first base actually was. I went weeks there before my first actual attack by an enemy instead of spooky sounds or furniture moving around or a banshee bringing me a gift instead of a bad death or a wedding invitation. Wedding invitation? We'll return to that. But yeah, don't feel like you have to stay in the second hideout. You should head there after you get some bug armor, a shovel, and a pistol, or if you're somehow actually good at melee combat at this point. You should definitely move it at some point though, because the next areas are crazy bad. And Silent Forest is a good way to get a little cozier with the combat before you start getting swarmed by the many horrors to come. It's not just the increase in enemies that will bust down your precious barricade that takes resources to rebuild, or that they come inside and chase you around. It's those things combined with the increased amount of night events. Sometimes multiple events, like all your barricade furniture suddenly flying around the room as beetles begin tracking poison throughout your hideout, will occur at once as you are attacked by enemies. Sometimes that enemy is a banshee. In the Dry Meadows base, you would usually get between 1 and 2 events per night. Realistically, if a Dry Meadows event is gonna get you, it's probably gonna be the wedding, the day after the night has passed. You hear a knock at the door in the middle of the night. If you open it, which can and will, in my case did, let monsters in, you find an envelope on the ground in front of the door. It's an invitation to a wedding, with a series of numbers, a code scrawled onto it. Depending on how thoroughly you have scoured the Dry Meadows biome, you may have found a location called the wedding. If so, now is the time to head over for the blessed event. If not, get exploring that scary meadow. You really do need all the logs, bits of scrap metal, and half-full cans of gasoline, which you can combine actually, just sort of drag one over the other. You'll figure it out. The wedding is one of the absolute highlights of the game, in my opinion. It occurs extremely early while you're still at the first base, seemingly placed to inform a player that yes, this is indeed a survival horror game. And yes, it will increase the amount of money and shame that you expend at the dry cleaners. I'm not going to go over every event in the game in detail like this. This is already stupid long. But the wedding is special. I have to go over the wedding. The wedding's location was due south of the Dry Meadows base in my playthrough, so the next morning I headed on down to pay my respects to whatever loathsome mutated beasts were tying the old knot. The fields leading up to the farmhouse where the wedding was apparently being held were oddly maze-like, with many of the roads being blocked off at various ends, others with gaps you could slide between. Having played a couple of games before, I knew this meant trouble ahead, but also probably loot and a good time, so whatever. Passing the skeleton of an ancient thresher, a chained-up dog started sprinting at me. I misjudged the length of his tether, and he took a nice, juicy bite. Backpedaling, I try to whack him as best I can. I get him to the end of the leash, but continue to misjudge the range of my board and miss him multiple times before finally getting slightly better at this simple task, and whacking the poor chained-up dog in the face enough times to drop him. I proceeded into a collapsing building that opens into an area with a festive wagon and a woman in a wedding dress spinning around in a solitary dance. A very creepy and suspicious solitary dance. I keep my distance as I look around. After a while of skirting around the area and then getting closer and then finally dismissing her as a threat, I found a locked door. I find the code for my invitation, plug it in, and enter the next area of the wedding, which is the farmhouse itself. The dining room area is inaccessible, so I went through the kitchen where a pig dined on something unspeakable on the floor. I walked around him and exited through a side door into the backyard, where I saw the person in the wedding dress briefly run past my field of vision. Following them, I find a broken down tractor with some of that sweet loot, and then climb into the dining room through an open window. The room is in shambles. There's a long table with a seated man at the far end. who was continuously smashing his head against the table. "We've been waiting for you," he informs between self-bludgeonings. The constant sound of distorted fiddle music plays along with the rhythmic thumping of this infected man's skull bouncing off of the wood. I progress past this figure, back outside, to an area that feels like a darkened tree maze. The trunks casting crazy shadows everywhere as multiple figures dressed in wedding gowns spin in circles and ask us if we'd like to dance. There is nothing but disquiet to be found in this area, so I headed back out and noticed that the man thumping his head had vanished. I walked towards the previously locked main door into this room when I saw the message, all in caps, appear on screen. "We've been waiting for you!" And a creature dressed in the ragged remains of a filthy wedding gown smashes through the door. It basically is a huge mouth. It looks like the top half of a human body that is split apart, revealing razor-sharp teeth, with legs that still possess enough strength to allow the creature to sprint. I initially try to fight back, but it charges straight at me, taking huge chunks out of my health bar as it shouts, "Dance with me!" I decide to flee and somehow make it back outside. I can hear it behind me and at one point think I'm clear, just to turn around and see it right behind me, still gaining. The only ambient sound now is this rhythmic metallic thumping, like the heartbeat of a steel mill. I juked into the broken maze-like rows of the field, and it all clicked. I knew this was going to happen. No gasoline comes for free in this world. It's either at the price of your dignity or the price of the bandage it takes to recover from basically any state in this game. I somehow get out of the field and head straight back to base. My inventory was full of all the wedding loot I could carry, including pills, a magazine for what at the time seemed like an amazing future gun, an individual bullet, substantially less impressive, but still useful for future me, different pills, meat, and the aforementioned gasoline. My hands were still shaking when I arrived back home. The wedding event had instilled me with a sense of impending dread from the moment I realized the implications of the maze-like rows, till minutes after I came fleeing back out of them, too terrified to look back and make sure the growling horror wasn't still following me, needing only a brief lapse on my part to catch up and come roaring back at me from just outside of my limited field of vision. After you finally find Wolfman at his Silent Forest base, he tells you the general location of the village where we can find the chicken lady we discussed earlier. If you show Wolf the wedding invitation left on your doorstep, he will tell you that he knows about the place but has always avoided it. There's been constant music coming from the location, day and night, for as long as the wolf can remember. He suggests you find a way to cover your deformed face, or there won't be any dancing partner for you. Little does he know you've already been, and had a dance partner literally throw themselves at you. I wondered if he'd be jealous. This is the first of 2 villages you discover. This one is still habitable, but on the verge of total collapse, in the grip of a famine due to overdependence on a soul-failing food source. It's been years since the woods went mad and took over, a sick and impenetrable forest that isolates the residents from the outside world, while simultaneously locking them in with the mysterious plague that spreads alongside the forest, both ever-consuming. Unlike any other place in Darkwood, there's a lot of what is technically still human life found here. The surviving villagers are, however, all suffering from various symptoms we come to learn are characteristic of the mysterious illnesses burning through the remaining population. There is one or maybe even several diseases that cause a myriad of different symptoms, but all result in the infected becoming some form of the various monsters we encounter. One of us. The savages are the least mutated and most common of these. Let's call them end-stage plague victims. Before wandering off into the forest, their mind fully consumed by the dark whispers of the plague siren song. These infected suffer from a few extreme and telling symptoms. Amongst savages, hearing voices seems ubiquitous, with some of them becoming catatonic and unresponsive, holding a conversation only they can hear. They demonstrate a growing obsession with the forest, and will devour even the earth from whence it grows. Near or after they reach end stage, they gain the ability to eat and digest wood, with groups of them often found gnawing on branches, while others beat their heads against trees in what I assume to be an attempt to shut out the voices. One of the most troubling behaviors these guys exhibit is they're the ones that create the large geometric shapes or glyphs you often see carved into the dirt throughout the woods, often complete with grim sacrifices, usually consisting of a human and an animal corpse bound together or near each other or inside each other. These are alluded to be where some of the more unspeakable denizens we meet come from. The forest absorbing these hybrid sacrifices and birthing horrifying chimeras. Although this is never conclusively stated, to my knowledge. They also tend to not only cover themselves with mud and sticks, but create strange effigies or even reappropriate existing holy symbols, covering them with mud and sticks. They seem to be trying to assume the appearance of the woods or whatever grim intelligence is guiding the plague that has utterly devoured their minds and personalities. Once they're bashing down your barricades and getting stuck in your traps in the middle of the night, there's nothing left of the person who once was. So it's a mercy, really. Another direction, symptomatically, that the plague can take, turns the victim into what's known as a chomper. These monstrosities make the sad souls that turn into savages seem like lottery winners. Their lives sure are as short as a lot of lottery winners. Anyway, the plague forms this scar down the middle of the sufferer's forehead that eventually spreads down to their navel. Inside this scar, dozens of razor-sharp teeth are forming, and the host begins to get horrible, excruciatingly painful headaches, for what should be obvious reasons. Their head and arms begin to get larger, bulbous, until they cannot take the pain anymore and lie down, usually in the dark somewhere. After a time, they split open from head to navel, revealing rows of teeth. They attack by charging straight at you and chomping you between the two halves of what used to be their head and torso. This is the type of creature that attacked us during the wedding. Several main characters are suffering from these kinds of woods-born illnesses. The doctor is clearly suffering from the savage variety, whereas the musician, met later, is turning into a chomper. Wolfman may very well be one of these chimeras the wood fuses together from the remains of animal and man. Though again, this is never confirmed, but strongly hinted at. There's a bit of a, let's say, fungal infection thrown in here too, but you don't see much of this in chapter 1 outside of the trader, so I will save it for a bit later. So everyone in the village is suffering from some stage of these forms of plague, with one exception, who seems to be a bit of an outlier. These plagues, compounded with the impending famine, implies that no matter what you do here, the villagers aren't going to last much longer. As you wander around, most of the villagers call you a freak and tell you to stay away. If you linger long, many will attack you. You can kill them or leave them alone with their plethora of miseries, which is what I did. A bit later, you can choose to kill the giant mutated sow whose offspring they've been using to stay fed. The Wolfman and a random woman in the village will urge you to do so, with the Wolfman even rewarding you. I avoided this entire quest because, well, I didn't want to starve like 24 sick and terrified people only because they were distrustful of a clearly infected, deformed stranger in this village that's been isolated from the rest of the world for years. But, actually, once I had spoken to the chicken lady and the musician and found out what the villagers threw in the well, I did revisit my initial instinct, but I decided on mercy in the end. Again, no. The chicken lady lives in the northeastern part of the village, just north of the holes. Holes? Which will be revisited later. She, like most of the villagers, is suspicious of you immediately. Unlike the others, she's willing to converse with you. She talks about the downfall of the village and bemoans her and her hen's fates. If you show her an item you may have found earlier, a plastic chicken, she immediately tenses up and asks you where you got it. She claims you gave it to her brother Janik, who got mad and went off with that brainy fella. She hands you a picture of this brainy fella, and it's the same doctor who stole your key, because of course it is. Wandering around the village, you can also hear several other villagers bemoaning the actions of the doctor and cursing his existence. Back inside the chicken lady's hut, as other characters refer to it, locked away in the back room is the pretty lady. The very thing the Wolfman has expressed interest in. He wants the key so he can access this pretty lady and fulfill what other dark desires spur this unnatural fusion of wolf and man. As you go to leave the conversation, a noise like a hoarse and elderly cat who's just found his hole in Amigara vault starts up outside. Hole. The chicken lady tells you it's that damn musician and starts cursing him loudly. I never spoke to her again during my playthrough, but apparently if you kill her, she has a map with the doctor's current location, allowing you to skip both the Wolfman and musician's quest lines. Speaking of the musician, heading outside to locate the rogue cat tormentor, we see a figure with a violin dodge beneath a broken tractor. Once confronted, he tells us that he watches the pretty lady as she changes. Whether that means he watches her change clothes or mutate, it's anyone's guess. He says the chicken lady hates him and won't let him or anyone see her. He pulled her wreath out of the river at something called the Pollinite? Apparently means he gets to marry her now. No, she's a giant mutated cannibal lady or something like that. Anyway, he wants you to bring the key to him instead of Wolfman, and tells you that he last saw Mr. Jan, or Janik, the chicken lady's brother, who vanished with the doctor, over by the well. And now we get to what the villagers throw in the well. In order to get the key from Janik's house, you have to climb down the village well, which, aside from being generally dark and spooky, has a unique red chomper inside. One that's a lot smaller than most, and drops a doll. Turn out this kid is the daughter of the woman in the village who, like Wolf, wants you to kill the sow and starve them all. She has an identical but burnt version of the doll found on the Chomper's corpse. The villagers must have thrown her kid into this well when it started to turn into a Chomper, so now she sits all day, rocking back and forth in the ruins of her burned house, wishing death on those who did this to her. To her daughter, no one has clean hands in this world. Desperation has forced everyone into impossible positions. This is largely why I didn't kill the sow and doom them all in the end. You can also find an entire area with bread ovens and a house nearby filled with corpses that they were apparently cremating in the ovens. I doubt they wanted to throw a living child to the flames and didn't know what else to do. She was going to turn into a danger to the rest of them any time, and they didn't have a lot of options left, especially with the only doctor being more likely to run experiments on her than help her in any way. So you put what remains of this poor doomed child down and find your way up to Janik's house at last. You find your key covered in chicken feces? Thanks, acid wizards. Now you have a dilemma on your hands. Does he go the guy who probably wants to eat the pretty lady, or the guy who wants to do other, less fatal, but also disturbing things to her? You know, the guy who watches her change? This isn't a great choice, but strongly disliking the musician's creeper vibes, and being at least somewhat responsive to Wolf's "we freaks gotta stick together" attitude, I chose to give the key to the Wolfman in the end. Also, he gives you a really good gun. This is where you get that fabled second achievement and might notice the massive drop-off in player retention. Congratulations, you made the cut, you're in the club. Now, stop watching this video immediately because I'm gonna spoil the rest of this right now. As for the remaining 90-something% of you, let's go. I didn't take this path, so I'm not gonna go in as depth here, but if you were to give the key to the musician, what would happen? Well, in preparation for his wooing of the pretty lady, he asks you to retrieve a violin from his parents' house. Once you reach the house, it's obvious that both are in the midst of becoming chompers. You can kill them or spare them. If you kill them, the musician buries them, hates you, and eventually gets eaten by the pretty lady. If you don't kill them, the parents kill the musician. If you do what I did and go Wolfman, but do kill the sow, he apparently moves in with you during Chapter 2. Not a joke. Considering his creepier inclinations and marked lack of actual ability with the violin, pretty glad I made the choices and I never saw him again. But what is the deal with the pretty lady? I haven't discussed her much because I didn't see her a single time during my playthrough. When I tried to enter her room, I didn't have the feces-covered key, and after I got it, I just gave it to Wolfman. I went back later when she was already gone because I heard you could get a military flashlight and some fabric, but I never actually interacted with her at all. Apparently she's a bit of an outlier, not turning into a savage or a chomper so much as just a huge mutated lump that occasionally eats people. She will eventually eat her sister if you do nothing. If you send the musician her way, she eats him. If you haven't guessed by now, the name Pretty Lady is ironic, like calling a tall guy tiny. She sounds as bad as any other monster in this game, and the chicken lady probably keeps her locked up for the remaining villagers' protection as much as that of the pretty lady herself. If you kill her, she drops a wedding ring, identical to the one you can get in the hunter's cabin, which shines a bit of light on why the Wolfman is interested in her. But first, before we conclude that sordid mystery, we need to discuss the one character I've neglected to mention so far, mainly because he has such a minor role in the story itself. The only thing he's attached to gameplay gameplay-wise is one workshop upgrade, and let's go with 1.5 locations. I'm talking about Rocket Man himself, Piotrek. Unlike most of the other characters, I don't think the woods going mad has changed him, or revealed any terrible truths buried deep inside his soul. I'm not sure that Piotrek has any idea what's going on whatsoever. For all I know, building a rocket was something he was trying to do well before anything crazy started happening. When we meet Piotrek, he's living alone in an abandoned house, not unlike our own series of barely defendable bases. He wants you to bring him various tractor parts so he can build a rocket. And if you indulge him, as I did, thinking it a harmless daydream, he rewards you with one of the most rare and precious items in the game, a welder you need for one of the workshop upgrades. And if you want to be a proper hobo with a shotgun cosplayer in a few hours, you're gonna need every workshop upgrade available. What is less expected is his rocket actually working. Well, kinda. If you return to his home after giving him the last of the rocket parts, which are again just random bits you yank off of broken down tractors, you'll discover the heap of machinery he called a rocket is missing, and a huge scorch mark is in its place. The crazy bastard did it! He escaped the forest! You think until chapter 2. Once we find the junkyard location, we uncover the truth. Piotrek's rocket crashed into the junkyard shortly after takeoff, killing Piotrek in the process. We can loot his grilled corpse and the busted up rocket itself, netting us a ton of items late in the game, so yeah, still worth it. There's a bit of a scrap metal shortage in the swamp, and finding Piotrek's failed science experiment goes a long way towards mitigating that. His bad luck, or more accurately bad engineering, becomes our good luck, and I for one love it when I can profit from someone else's failures. Speaking of gray zone morality and the complicated consequences of our actions, it's about time to head to Wolf's camp in the old woods. We gave him his key, but he took off before fulfilling his end, instead asking us once again to track into a new and more dangerous biome to find him at his next base. All joking aside, my final interaction with the Wolfman was one of the most illuminating conversations in the game. The way Darkwood does character development is intriguing. If I may make a suggestion for the statistically speaking low number of you who are actually going to make it this far, make sure you explore a location called the Hunter's Cabin before you go to Wolf's third camp. Or don't, because I'm about to tell you all about it. It is entirely possible to never find the Hunter's Cabin, or if found, overlook the subtle environmental storytelling that it contains. It's a fairly dangerous location, which might keep even more players away. If by this point you have gained enough confidence with the combat system, or as in my case, crafted big enough guns, then you may want to confront the huge dog and 2 red chompers found in and around the property and fight your way inside. Even after you've taken care of the inhabitants, the cabin doesn't yield its secrets easily. It is but one more piece in a grand puzzle. What is apparent is that the hunter, predictably, had a love for taxidermy, as several stuffed animals can be found displayed throughout the house. You can interact with one of these trophies as you can with various other important story items. It's a wooden frame that once displayed a creature's head, but all that's left is the frame itself and a few tufts of hair still adhered to it. Someone or something pulled the taxidermized animal head from its mount for some mysterious purpose. Because we can interact with it specifically, unlike 99.9% of objects, we can assume it wasn't just damaged or broken in some tumult or another, and was torn free for some explicit purpose, with an idea in mind. In another room, we find the body of the hunter, oddly stripped of its clothing. It looks like someone has shot him and left him to bleed out, becoming the last body to find itself displayed under these crumbling walls. As everything else in this ruined landscape being slowly reclaimed by the atrocious forest and transformed into something new and of its image. On his body, we find a wedding ring matching that found on the pretty lady. It seems logical to reach the conclusion that the hunter and the pretty lady were married or engaged before the woods went mad. If you kill Wolf, you find a janky version of this wedding ring. These 3 are connected. This could help explain why Wolf wanted the key to Pretty Lady's room. But again, we're getting ahead of ourselves. Wolf's third base is completely unlike the first 2. Instead of an outdoor camp-style setup, it's in the back of a sprawling, dilapidated complex filled with plague dogs and would more adequately be described as a den or lair. It's clearly more of a permanent residence and has several, let's say, decorations adorning its walls. Wolf has a number of stuffed human bodies and heads on display in his home, a twisted chirality of the hunter's cabin. When we locate him standing in the darkness here, Wolf is happy, vibrating. practically bouncing up and down with puppy-like glee. For the first time, we see that there is more than a gruff, ultra-sus furry king here. There's at least a part of wolf that's still just a big old puppy dog. That said, if you haven't guessed, he killed Nate, the pretty lady, and left her remains in the blasted out shell of the church. Can also be found in the old woods, because he is still a very, very bad dog. But looking at him right now, if you've ever been around an excited pup that can't stop trying to jump on you and lick your face, that's the Wolfman. Like, that's how he acts. He does that here. Like, I was vaguely concerned he might start trying to hump my leg. This was a drastic change in him. I'd spent the entire game so far waiting for him to turn on me. I'd gotten some real Patches vibes off of him early on, and this 180 left me reeling. He'd previously said that you were buddies, but I'd taken it as an attempt at manipulation. Now I wasn't so sure. He seemed truly grateful to me for coming through for him, like he could finally let his guard down and even show some of that famous doggy affection toward his new buddy. Here, the worst monster in the woods was panting and drooling like a terrier with a tennis ball. Except because of the murder he just did, but yeah. As proven by his tasteful, Gain-inspired home furnishings. He'd clearly murdered multiple people before. Was he always like this afterward? Or was the pretty lady special somehow? He carries a counterfeit, almost melty version of the ring worn by the pretty lady, and seems absolutely vindicated. Relieved beyond expression by her death. What in the hell was going on between them? And how did the hunter fit into all of this? Like the traitor, Wolfman is another fan favorite, and has his own slew of theories surrounding him. There are two worth mentioning here, and one that I think holds the most water. The first is that the Wolfman, watching from afar, became obsessed with the pretty lady and developed a jealous hatred of the hunter. At some point, he crafts his own version of their wedding rings, as a kind of cold comfort. Think of it like a love triangle, where one party is a disfigured stalker that the other two parties are completely unaware of. Eventually, Wolf's hatred grows to the point where he breaks into the hunter's cabin and shoots him dead, at which point the chicken lady presumably locks her sister up in the house due to her worsening physical state and the threat Wolf poses. This is around the time you arrive, so the Wolfman enlists your help in tracking down the key he needs to finally get his clawed hands on the subject of his obsession and dark desires. I don't believe this theory. There are too many unanswered questions, and it requires you to either ignore too many loose threads or believe them to be unconnected to the hunter-wolf-pretty lady plotline. To understand what I believe to be the most likely theory, we have to return to the question of what the Wolfman actually is. Darkwood is an adherent of the Dark Souls school of lore distribution. Keep it item and environment based and as vague as possible so the player's imagination can do the heavy lifting. There are a few other characters that are hybrids, like Wolf. The Snail and Hole Guy come to mind. Hole? We also discover locations whose purpose seems to be demonstrating how something like the Wolfman could come to be. When covering the plague earlier, I talked about the strange glyphs and grisly sacrifices the savages started leaving throughout the forest once they reached the later stages of their illness. These sacrifices are bound human bodies with animal remains near or even inside of them. One that I found in the swamp was described as lizards jammed down a corpse's throat in the process of being absorbed by the wood. So if the woods can take human and animal remains and turn them into something new, the million-dollar question becomes, could it have combined the corpse of the hunter and the animal head, missing from the vandalized wall plaque we find in his cabin, to create the Wolfman? This theory is not without its faults. The hunter's corpse is still there, not digested by the woods, just naked. But if Wolf shot him, why didn't he eat any of them like he did the pretty lady? This theory, in my opinion, answers more questions than the first theory, which does nothing to answer the question of the Wolfman himself. Admittedly, both theories could also just be wrong. There's also the matter of the fungal clones we haven't talked about yet to consider. I'll revisit this theory once again after we get to the fungus among us. Sorry about that. Anyway, I believe the real story of Wolf went something like this. The hunter and the pretty lady were married before the woods went mad, but when the plague started spreading and infected the pretty lady, Her sister wanted to take her in so she could take care of her. When the hunter refused to let his wife be taken from him, the chicken lady or someone under her direction, maybe her brother Janik, shot him and left him for dead, taking the pretty lady away and locking her up in the chicken lady's back room. After a time, the woods found the hunter's body, along with some different raw materials in the form of a taxidermized animal present in the cabin. And from these husks, the forest birthed a new creature, one unique to the woods and maybe still housing some of the hunter's characteristics, feelings, perhaps buried memories. These half-remembered memories leads him back to the cabin at some point, where he finds the hunter's corpse. Driven by this strange impulse he doesn't understand, Wolf strips him down and wears his clothes. He maybe finds an old picture of himself and his wife, or some other clue that points him towards his wife's family. He's afraid of the chicken lady, but doesn't know exactly why, so he enlists the help of a stranger instead of dealing with her directly. He's obsessed with the pretty lady, maybe even hates knowing she's suffering. We have no way of knowing. He doesn't remember when he was born, but has always had a strange, almost melted and imperfect ring, and carries it with him. It brings him a small amount of comfort, but he doesn't know why exactly. He's drawn to the village and human beings, and is still human enough himself to grow cruel after they repeatedly drive him away and treat him like a monster. Sometimes treating someone like a monster long enough can make them give up and just become the monster you want them to be. After you help him scratch this itch he doesn't quite understand, he feels like a man with a huge weight removed from his back. He feels whole and satisfied for the first time. For me, the best evidence of this theory can be found in the presence of taxidermy in both locations. In a game like Darkwood, everything distinct that you see in a location is placed intentionally and holds some meaning. We can disagree on what the meaning ultimately is, but not that there is a meaningful connection between the hunter having taxidermy animals adorning his wall and the Wolfman having taxidermy humans. This is as meaningful in my eyes as the fact that all three have similar wedding rings, or that Wolf seems to be wearing the clothes the hunter was shot in. The fungal cloning theory offers an explanation as to why he has his own funky version of the ring. There's also other evidence of the forest creating chimera creatures from the remains of humans and animals. There is no other evidence of any love triangle, just the fact that all three have rings. That's it. This was the first time I had found myself really consumed by the lore in this game, especially how it deals with ethics and consequences. I consider myself to be a consequentialist. I believe that an action's morality is determined by its consequences. Dramatically oversimplified, this means if it results in mostly good things, it's good. Mostly bad things, it's bad. But if all choices will result in bad outcomes, the ethical thing to do is select the option with the less bad outcome. You know, the idea of a lesser evil. None of the moral choices in this game have good outcomes. It's just some outcomes are less bad, and sometimes only if viewed from a certain angle, like your own perspective. They all have multiple layers of moral complexity that need to be weighed against each other. The choices that seem to have obviously good and bad options are misleading you. Before I go on this rant, keep in mind that giving Wolf the key does not influence his previous murders at all. Those already happened. We're not discussing the overall morality of the character, rather the player's moral culpability for the consequences resulting from the choice. Basically, I'm about to rationalize my decision to give a carnivorous monster easy access to its future prey. So, buckle up. Sure, at first glance, the musician seems like the quote, good option, as he's definitely less likely to kill the pretty lady. He's creepy, but not in overt danger to the pretty lady's safety, as is the case with Wolf. But giving him the key will eventually result in either his parents killing him, or him being eaten by the pretty lady herself. The good choice here is a death sentence. Giving the musician what he wants is sentencing him to die. The only way he survives the game is to refuse him the key. Further flattening the field are the implications of giving someone who's obviously an obsessed stalker unrestricted access to the subject of their obsession. I'm aware the same could be applied to Wolf, but giving the key to Wolf doesn't lead to a string of homicides, just the one. Point is, the musician isn't an obviously grand choice either, he just seems better compared to Wolf. The musician says he wants to save the pretty lady from her sister, but considering the fact that the pretty lady can and will kill two other characters, depending on how the story shakes out, is it not safer to assume that the chicken lady is keeping her locked away for her own safety and or the safety of others? This isn't Romeo and Juliet. Both of the star-crossed lovers here are infected with an incredibly dangerous disease that is slowly turning them both into murderous monsters. This is really more of a hell is empty kind of situation. Wolfman kills her, Sure, but she's turning into an immobile cannibal, and in this world he's arguably doing her a favor. Or he may even be doing out of subconscious altruism because he loved her in a different life and can't stand what she's turned into. Just can't remember why. Even if it's solely out of a thirst for blood, the Wolfman's path results in less overall bloodshed. The musician's path can result in you killing his parents killing him, or the pretty lady killing him. All brutal outcomes. It sounds cruel, but giving the key to Wolf results in at least someone's happiness and satisfaction. Wolfman's the only person in the entire game that can get what he wants without some sort of dire consequence or implication looming. Well, at least not for him. He gets no ending blurb explaining his fate either. We last see him after he leads us to the doctor's hideout, as he promised, directly after he slobbers all over your face with gratitude. That's about as close to a happy ending as you get in Darkwood. Like, ethically speaking, it leads to better outcomes to let the menace to society get at if you have a choice. Hell, maybe even kept Wolf's bloodlust sated until the end of the game by letting him eat the murder pillow. Or you can always say screw them both and just kill the chicken lady. Again, she drops the doctor's location. Like, you can bypass both of them, just go on about your business. The Old Woods is consistently considered the hardest part of the game. The swamp has rougher terrain and worse monsters, but you're armed to the teeth. Here you're still under-equipped and there are hordes of chompers around every corner. I'd give the swamp centipedes the award for worst monster in Darkwood, but chompers are a close second. They make a beeline straight for you and can feel almost unfightable if you're not really consistently good at melee at this point, or haven't got enough pistol ammo or a single-shot shotgun quite yet. Once acquired, the latter weapon trivializes single chompers, since they tend to run straight into your barrel, and then one square meal of buckshot ends him immediately. Finding Wolf and asking him to make good on his promise to take us to the doctor's old hideout is always the obvious goal in this area. So I tried to focus on that and spent as little time in this horrible place as possible. Having got wind of the dire reputation of spending the nights here, I ran back to my hideout in the Silent Forest or even Dry Meadows every night, after unlocking the transition location connecting the Old Woods and Dry Meadows. There, I largely spent my nights, with some notable exceptions, fighting the odd savage or dog with a shovel until sunrise, and using the reputation saved to hoard ammo bought from the trader. After our heartfelt reunion and slobbery expressions of eternal gratitude, Wolf led me safely to the doctor's old hideout and departed from my save file forever. Maybe. I couldn't bring myself to kill him for his assault rifle, despite having found several magazines for it at that point. He takes you to a path that leads you back to the beginning of the story, only this time you see a bit more of the doctor's old hideout. Call it a fresh angle. Turns out he had an outbuilding he was using as a kind of makeshift hospital. We found several rooms with beds. Most of these beds contain corpses or even unresponsive masses of mutated flesh. But one being is still coherent. He's unnamed, simply called Madman, and is in the final moments before transforming fully into a chomper. He gives you a pretty good idea of the kinds of symptoms the plague can put you through before turning you. There are a few hints to this earlier, but the doctor did not start out paranoid and brutal. When the woods started going mad, he legitimately tried his best to diagnose and treat the villagers. It's just, how? So you infiltrate the building you were held prisoner in, climbing through the window next to the first person you killed in this bark-coated hellscape. Your combat training. You explore around a bit and discover a key and a note pointing you towards the doctor's current whereabouts. If you go out front, you can clearly see the wooden doll the doctor crafted the musician's mask from. And if you killed it during the tutorial, the rotting corpse of a dog. If you let it live, the very alive, angry plague dog the doctor's pet became. Turns out, you have to kill the dog one way or another, or let it kill you, I guess. Maybe use an ability and run, toss some meat. Okay, I guess if you were creative enough, you could still not kill the dog. Here we find out the doctor had been hiding out in the back of an old train, which, on my map, was very close to the doctor's house, so I didn't have far to run. You unlock the train car and finally, after so many horrors faced, confront him at last. Now you can just rush in, guns blazing, kill him wordlessly, and scoop up the key. There's no punishment for doing this, but I highly recommend leaving him alive. He becomes a bit of an exposition dump and drops more little tidbits of info every time you see him in the future. He confirms what I had already suspected, that he was more in over his head than an actual villain. He'd been trapped there for years. The villagers turned to him when the plague first appeared, but He had no idea what these diseases were or where they came from. In his own words, "I'm just a regular doctor. What was I supposed to do?" These words ring true to me, especially after considering how the villagers treated you, the stranger, as well as our buddy, the Wolfman, who also seems driven to hatred by the villagers' distrust and animosity. The villagers turned on the doctor when he couldn't cure them, so he turned to more desperate measures, performing strange experiments in a last-ditch effort to make progress. These experiments were morally wrong, especially for a doctor, but no one here is innocent anymore. In order to get this far, you've had to make decisions that have at the very least resulted in either the pretty lady, chicken woman, or musician's deaths, well as probably Piotrex's. This is of course assuming you didn't just run around the village popping heads, which you can absolutely do with little issue. After hearing the doctor out, I realized that this situation has made monsters, literally and figuratively, out of every single person trapped here. Desperation can make monsters of us all. In my opinion, the idea of black and white, good versus evil thinking is rarely representative of the entire picture. And as such, the more nuanced moral quandaries in this game really work for me. I decided not to harshly judge the inhabitants of this forest. This place has made the stranger into a monster in less than a month. These people have been trapped here for years. Instead of killing the doctor and taking the key, I pointed on the map where the door the key opened could be located, and he promised to meet me at the door in the morning. I went back to the Dry Meadows base for one last night, reflecting on everything I'd learned about this dark and strangled world and its complex inhabitants. Most people aren't good or evil. Most people are just trying to get by and survive, maybe find a little happiness. They don't know how to deal with a completely unexpected and unknown horror like this. No, the only thing that you can point your finger at here is the forest itself. Whatever grim intelligence drives it, if one even does. We've had precious few answers to the question of what the woods is or what it wants. Can motive even be attributed to it? Well, we're headed towards Chapter 2 finally, and with it, hopefully answers at last. As Chapter 2 opens, we enter what appears to be an old sewer or tunnel system beneath the forest, along with the doctor. After traveling along with the doctor for a few moments, we encounter a mass of what appears to be roots and mold or meat blocking the path forward. Amongst the rotting wreckage, there is the form of a man, in the midpoint of being absorbed or emerging. He tells you that he was trying to escape, but the way was blocked by a huge talking tree. He pulls a stone out of his own head and throws it at you. It's like a bullet, yet malleable. The doctor runs off, terrified, but we haven't seen the last of him quite yet. As you follow him into the only route forward, you hear voices calling out to you. "I only wanted to pass." Other people have been trapped here and absorbed by the tree roots. They howl at you as you run past. "Return to my family." As we proceed, the way is blocked by a large alligator-like creature called Swamper. We blast it to pieces, and it surprisingly echoes the cries of those we passed as it dies. Seems we just discovered where swampers come from. We emerge through a trap door into the swamp base, the final base in the game. Until now, I've neglected to mention a different fan-favorite character. When you move to the Silent Forest, you'll find a bike bell in the workshop. When used, it summons the Bike Man, who offers to bring you the stuff you have stashed in a previous base in exchange for a bottle of alcohol. Cause he's a huge drunk, which actually sounds pretty reasonable considering the situation. Make sure you take your booze out of the workbench before asking him to ferry your stuff though. He will steal and drink all of it, but he at least leaves the empty bottles. You can use the bell again to move from the second base to the third if you're crazy enough to stay in the third base. Anyway, this guy is not available in Chapter 2. I hope you carefully packed your pockets and brought some key items like all of the ammo with you, because you're never going to see whatever you left behind again. We've passed the point of no return, and there's no going back to the locations from Chapter 1. So how the swamp works is this. There's water everywhere, so travel is more difficult and takes longer. We gotta head home sooner in the day to safely make it before nightfall. And the monsters are worse, but never you mind that. You're about 3 sets of pliers away from becoming the true god of this world. And any world, really. Hobo with a shotgun. Though ammo is still incredibly limited, you still generally have enough to go kill everything at a location fairly easily. The pump-action shotgun holds 8 rounds and kills everything with one direct hit. I still limited the amount of ammo I had on me as I discovered killing everything that came at me resulted in running out of ammo within minutes. But once I always had a fully loaded pump action stashed in the workbench, there was nothing I couldn't handle, just stuff I chose not to handle because I was saving my ammo for main story locations. One night I killed like 6 things that came for me. Would have been absolute death in any other base, but I had to spend the next 4 nights fighting with my shovel to regain the ammo I needed to finish the game. Some of these later locations are pretty swamped with enemies. I'm sorry. The swamp is fun. It's the part of the game where you've made it through the underpowered, fragile part of the survival horror game and come out the other side. So now you get to go on a bit of a revenge tour. We made it. We're finally the worst monster in the woods. By now, we've grown as a player to the point where dying at night is more entertaining than terrifying, and you can actually take a few with you, even if all you have is a sharpened shovel and a dream. A dream of decapitating at least 3 of the 6 spiders attacking you at 5 a.m. before going down in a blaze of glory. Instead of the previous chorus of whimpering every time you heard something walk past a window. Oh yeah, the other horrifying creatures you encounter here are human spiders that throw chunks of themselves at you, which then become other human spiders. Fun! Centipedes that take over human corpses and use them to chase you around like a hound of hell over vast distances, except far, far faster than the actual hounds found in the game, as well as these living tree roots that attach themselves to you, restricting your movement, applying poison damage. If one of these grows attached to you at the wrong moment, like if you're being chased by anything I've just mentioned, it usually means a bad death. I'll admit that when you first arrive in the swamp, it's a bit of a pain, however. When you emerge from the sewer, you're still about 3 workbench upgrades away from the precious pump-action shotgun. And the only other death stick tier assault weapon in the game, unless you did kill the Wolfman and have his assault rifle, isn't craftable and is only found in the most ridiculously dangerous area of the game, the Great Lake, which I don't recommend even going near unless you have a really good strategy for taking down like a dozen black chompers. Speaking of black chompers, there's a new mechanic introduced in the swamp. Some enemies are now found covered in black goo that has to be burned off with the light source, like a flashlight, before you can shotgun down the infected creature. So unless you can get the goo off them while chasing you, then kill all of them, or just make a mad dash for the assault rifle, you gotta find like 3 pairs of pliers before you rise to the legendary hobo with a shotgun tier. A place you're going to find one of these pairs of pliers is after finding the second set of holes. In the first village, there were these holes south of the chicken lady's house that, if one had the courage to actually enter, turned out to be a shortcut back to your base. The swamp has another set of these holes, along with a familiar pair of glowing eyes. Hole Guy is found in both locations, declaring his ownership over the holes. In the swamp, after coming back through the hole from the base for the first time, he comes out to say hello. Hiya, Hole Guy. These are indeed your holes, buddy. We're just utilizing them, which we're real grateful you're not attacking us over. Hole Guy's my favorite. I will purge any and all comments disparaging him. You make fun of me, leave Hole Guy alone. He's the channel mascot and will be shown due respect. I mean, just look at these amazing holes. You ever seen holes as great as these? Just so deep and moist and... Oh, I'm recording. Oh, okay then. The second village can be found in the swamp too, though it's noticeably less hospitable and, well, habitable than the one in the Silent Forest. Though if you killed the sow, probably not much of a village left over there anymore. The swamp village seems to be ground zero or close to it for everything that's been happening with the woods. As I've mentioned before, we've come along at the end of an event that's been unwinding for years. These few desperate survivors you find, they've been living with daily trauma the entire time. Apparently you are, or at least were, one of a group of people that have been observing or studying what's been happening in the woods. You were an outsider looking in until the doctor found you injured, separated from your group, and injected you with the essence of the woods themselves. You've been becoming more and more a part of the woods ever since. The swamp is where we start finding other evidence of people like you being around or having been around, until recently anyway. This is why I recommended letting the doctor live. He drops several juicy lore nuggets, and watching his physical and mental deterioration gives us a clearer picture of how the plague turns people into savages. When we first run back into the doctor, for me this was outside of a toppled shrine in the swamp village, we notice he's starting to look, well, a bit rough. He has a strange circle on his forehead, and it's hard to tell if he's put it there using dirt or charcoal, or if it's similar to the lines that form down the face when somebody is turning into a chomper. He's almost normal, however. He mentions that he's been hearing her voice, but he has said something similar to that in the prologue while torturing you. He has a theory to tell you. He believes that outsiders like you, the ones that have been watching the whole thing go down behind the trees, are a disease. The things in the woods, including the villagers, are like white blood cells, and that's why the outsiders hide from them, why they're afraid of them. He grows quite smug after his observation. He also talks about the early days of the woods going mad. He was in this village when everything started falling apart. He laments all the wasted work, patching up people who are only going to die a few short years later. He was the only doctor in the area when everything started. He also verifies that instead of a single plague with multiple paths it can take, there are different unknown diseases that started appearing around the same time the trees started growing out of control and blocking off paths out of the area. We learned that the swamp only recently flooded and used to be more like the region in Chapter 1. Maybe, given time, the silent forest and old woods will just become more swamp. The second time we encounter the doctor in the swamp, he's very clearly deteriorating physically and mentally, but still able to communicate. The circle on his forehead has been accentuated using mud. More and more, he's starting to resemble the other savages, the ones we've been fighting this entire time. He's becoming. He's happily eating mud and tells us that there's an electrical current running through the ground, through everything. Considering what I've heard about the radio tower ending, he's probably onto something. The third and final time I saw him, he was unrecognizable. Mud caked all over his head and torso. Large sticks had been stuck into the mud and jut out at weird angles. He almost seems to attack us, but backs off and starts happily munching the bark on a stick. Once he's done, he pushes the bare stick through his head mud with the others. He's like every other savage we encountered, but with one difference: he doesn't try to kill us. This is an interesting difference. Is it the last shred of recognition that stays his violence? Or are we getting far enough along in our own transformation for some denizens of the woods to stop considering the stranger a stranger? Or as the doctor would put it, a disease for which the native population is the only cure. On the second day in the swamp, you find the corpse of the traitor just outside of your new base. On the viewport of the helmet he's been fused with is scratched the word liar. On his corpse, you find a key like your own, but different. It's like it has mold growing on it, or it's made of mold, just in the shape of a key. There's also a strange book that appears to be made of sheets of mushroom or something. We have no idea what any of this means at the moment, however. There is no real clue as to who killed him. There are 3 new traitors appearing every morning in his place. Was this a territorial dispute? If so, why deface his personage with the word liar? I didn't connect these dots myself, but if you had killed Wolf and got his strange version of a wedding ring, you may notice that the key the traitor had on him seems to be made of similar stuff. If you were to compare it to some other items you may have picked up, the malleable bullet the man in the tunnel dug out of his own head, for instance, you would again notice the similarities. There's a good reason for all of this, but we need a few more pieces of this particular puzzle before we break it all down. I made several trips to the village because on my playthrough it was extremely close to my base. On my second trip, I encountered a bald-headed man, bearded, with wide, staring eyes. This man is referred to only as the Cripple, though there are a few hints as to his real identity in-game. He's the only survivor still living in the village and within spitting distance of a gigantic talking tree. We learn from him that what we see before us ain't no tree. From its bark grow the faces of everyone from the village, and it's with their voices that it speaks. Apparently it can't shut up, incessantly blathering, and keeping the crippled man from sleeping, or maintaining his sanity for that matter. He'd probably have gone completely insane by now if he hadn't also gone blind, which at least spared him from having to look at the fake faces of his former friends and loved ones. He begs you to destroy the tree, to let him die in peace. If you continue to question him and show him items, he will let slip that the tree is blocking what has consistently been referred to as the road home. He suggests destroying the tree's roots, which he thinks could be accessed via a flooded basement that leads underneath the tree. There isn't all that much to be learned from interacting with the tree itself. Its voices speak all together, and it's just a chaotic stew of ramblings. There's one face, however, that seems to be trying to communicate. Seems like he's trying to mouth the words radio tower, which would have been more important had I chosen a different path to the ending. I was unfortunately never going to see this radio tower in my game. If you start kicking pieces off the tree, it regrows almost instantly. If we were to get past this thing, we should probably start working out a way to destroy it entirely. It takes a bit of figuring out, but the stranger's goals in the swamp are to fix the broken compressor found in the swamp base and get an empty gas canister that you can fill using the repaired compressor. You find a note that marks a location called the cottage near the junkyard onto your map. You can probably logic out that the parts you need for the compressor have something to do with this junkyard. Probably. You can dig up a bunch of equipment here at a dire expense to your shovel's durability, causing you to likely have to repair and come back multiple times. But you will not be able to find the compressor parts without first visiting the cottage near the junkyard and dealing with the snail. Once you find your way through a small path littered with half-formed snail shells and general weird snail filth, you will find a ruined building with a giant shell on top of it. You can locate a soft part of the shell around the side and use a melee weapon to enter it, wherein, curled up in a little smear in the back, is the snail himself. He troublingly appears to have a humanoid skeleton over which the soft muscle part of the snail grows. Speaking with him is a fairly disturbing affair. You can kill the snail to gain entry to the cottage, or free the snail by killing some massive nodes or eyes about a screen away past a small puzzle. I freed the snail, not really wanting to contribute yet more suffering to this horrid place. Once you've freed him, you come back the next day and can find a note that shows you where in the junkyard to dig, opening up 2 more digging spots you were unable to access without the note. One of these has the compressor parts. The second part of this task is quite a bit harder to figure out. You cannot just intuit where to find the empty oxygen tank, or even that that's what you need in order to progress. It's more likely that the player will find the quest that results in you receiving the oxygen tank naturally as they explore new locations. Which makes it even more irritating that the location you have to find is super deep in a thick flooded forest that's only telegraphed by one narrow trail covered with flowers that is absolutely missable depending on which direction you're approaching from. I had to go look up what to do next on a guide at this point, which I usually didn't have to do with this game. I could generally figure out what the next goal was before this point. I think previously I'd only looked up how to get the key covered in chicken feces, and after I looked it up, I realized how many hints you're actually given on where to look next. This location is difficult to locate because the swamp trains you to stay out of the water as much as possible. You move slower, lose stamina faster, and there are things in the water waiting to take advantage of your lack of mobility. If you don't pass the trail with flowers because, let's say, the trail is on the opposite side of the location from where you would naturally approach from your base, then your training is going to make you reluctant to go very far into the completely flooded, low-visibility area that you need to explore in order to advance the main plotline of the game. I'm sure the location spawned in at an acceptable position for most of the people listening to this, and you're wondering what I'm on about. But the random generation of locations can create some disproportionately irritating situations sometimes. I love this game, and I understand not wanting to make it super easy for us, but the rest of Darkwood is surprisingly great at telegraphing where to go next and what to do, at least in a general kind of way. Anyways, you have to find this compound deep in the flooded forest where a family known as the Elephants live. They aren't mutants that resemble elephants. On the contrary, they're probably the least mutated people in the woods, due to the gas masks they always wear, the hoses attached to which lend them the affect of having elephant trunks. The mom seems like a real charmer, and immediately starts accurately accusing you of being unclean. If you put up with her crap long enough, she eventually tells you that one of her kids ran away for completely unknown and surprising reasons. Certainly not because the mother elephant seems to be ultra mega abusive towards her kids. No way. Well, anyway, he's run off to his grandma's house, and we're supposed to find him and bring him back. Which you can do, or you can just shoot the elephant lady and take the tank. It's a choice between returning a child to their abusive parent or murdering that parent, but also probably a couple of kids. Again, there really aren't many clean moral choices in Darkwood. I decided to go the less murdery route, if for no other reason than ammo is the single most important resource in the swamp. Also healing items, but hell, you can probably eat wood to heal by now. If you for some strange reason stick around and gossip with the elephants, you can learn some interesting stuff. Apparently the 3 traders that visit your base every morning are this woman's elder children. If you search the kid's room, you can find a couple of good clues as to his whereabouts. There are pictures of giant mushrooms and a crude map that lets you at least narrow down the area you must search, and like that, Darkwood returns to the good signposting. After working these clues, or if you're me, hours before you find the elephant's compound in the swamp, you will find an area that seems gray, blasted, filled with poisonous mushrooms and serpentine paths that must be navigated carefully, lest you run out of healing supplies and have to turn back for the day to go get more wood out of storage. Seated throughout the shroomy heath are these lumpy, half-absorbed humanoid figures. They speak as you pass by. If you listen long and carefully enough, you may notice that what these things are saying bears a striking similarity to the ambient chatter of the villagers in the Silent Forest. Not half-absorbed, these figures are half-formed. They are imperfect clones of the villagers, formed seemingly out of fungus or an otherwise unknown substance. This ability of the forest to clone or copy people, in the case of the Shroom Granny's house, entire buildings, is the key to multiple mysteries. This is possibly the process the woods use to create the chimeric monsters and characters we find throughout. Wolf is a hybrid clone of the dead hunters and a stuffed wolf head. Or maybe even the hunter's naked corpse is a clone, answering the mystery of why it's still just sitting, nude but otherwise undisturbed in the cabin. Maybe Wolf's clothes are his own and he took a bullet at some point. It's even possible that Wolf was copied from him before the hunter died and really was the one who shot him, taking his clothes afterwards. The snail is a clone of a man who used to live in the cottage and the snails he was eating during the last days alive. The character we're about to meet, Mushroom Granny, and her house are cloned from an old woman and her home in the village. The wood's ability to clone items and even buildings explains the strange ring Wolf has, and the key the trader has. Because the trader was a clone of you from before the doctor found you. The strange book he has is a replicated version of your journal. If you're as lucky as I am, you may notice a figure that looks exactly like the Wolfman wandering throughout the maze of fungi. What could someone like him be looking for out here? Once you find your way deep inside the Shroom Forest, there are the remains of a cottage that seem to be half formed out of fungus, not unlike the villagers located throughout the area. Inside this pale facsimile is a grandmotherly woman asleep in a rocking chair. Guess we found out why the big bad wolf is prowling around. He's Red Riding Hooding. The first time I was here, I hadn't found the elephants yet, so I didn't know who she was or what I was supposed to do with her. There's an option to eat the granny before she wakes up. I didn't eat the granny, but I did take one mushroom from her head before waking her up. Apparently, if you take several, she dies. I've also heard that if you eat her or pluck her to death, she just regenerates the next day because she's a fungal clone, but I never confirmed this. She didn't have much to say to me because I hadn't encountered the elephants at this point, so I left, perplexed. After I spoke with the elephants and came back, I was able to ask her about the kid, and she just kinda let me take him. Later on, I found out this was actually because I had chosen to let the sow live earlier in the playthrough. Had I killed the sow, I would have had to do a different quest to gain her trust and take the kid. Or you can just eat her or kill her and take the key, I guess. You can murder everyone you encounter in Darkwood and still find a way to beat the game. I think. Except the traitors. They just disappear and come back the next day if you attack them. I mean, the neutral way to find the doctor in Act 1 is to murder the chicken lady who just randomly has the doctor's current location written on a note on her corpse. Once you take the kid, however method, you thankfully don't have to escort him or anything truly terrifying like that. You just teleport instantly back to the elephant's compound. Can you imagine escorting a defenseless child through this swamp? With the spiders and centipedes and swampers? I was praying he'd just be an inventory item that I could put in a hotkey slot, so I wouldn't lose him if I died. Oh, if I haven't mentioned it before, you only lose the contents of your pack when you die. You keep all your hotkey items, at least on normal difficulty. Gonna level with you. If they'd have gone the escort mission route here, I would have scrapped this script and uninstalled. just like I did after that little game of asteroids in Dead Space, winner of the most befuddling way to wreck an otherwise great game award. Get that crap out of here. The asteroids minigame, not Dead Space. Anyway, you trade the child for an empty oxygen tank, go fill it at your newly repaired compressor, and that's it. Grab your ammo and whatever remains of your doubtlessly horribly mutated genitalia. This is it at last. The way out. The road home is just one impromptu removal of a horrifying monstrosity away. The cripple had mentioned something about a basement, which is near the tree in the swamp village. We finally use the oxygen tank to head down into the darkness below to perform our final desperate task. There are a few parts of the ending that I'd like to focus on, so I'm not going to give a moment-by-moment breakdown of it here, but I will give a general overview. This whole time, I've been leaving out about half of the details, focusing on what I personally experienced. Trust me, there's enough still left unspoken to merit a playthrough, even if you've spoiled yourself stupid by watching this. There are 2 routes to the ending. I'm only covering one of them here, the talking tree ending, because I still want people to go play the game. I just also want to talk about it without worrying about being spoilery. There's also a lot of people curious about the story, but can't get past the many ways the game is intentionally hard to control, or the retro top-down graphics. It's also because this video is already ridiculously long. After you acquire the oxygen tank, you use it to dive into a submerged hole, and emerge inside of the flooded basement the cripple was talking about. It's an old grain cellar or some other area where they stored food and emergency supplies. Here, one of the aforementioned mysteries I haven't touched on at all is sort of explained. And after making our way through the hallucinatory halls, we finally found a chamber filled with the tree's exposed roots. We set the tree on fire, but it will take a day for it to burn down completely, so we return to our base for a night. As night falls, we hear a voice from the damaged radio on the floor of the swamp base. In broken speech, it asks us, "Why did you do it?" Pocket dimensions of fire open all around the base. Burning figures pour through and attack. We can beat these burning figures back, but eventually we will be swarmed and unable to move. Despite this, I almost survived, but died about 30 seconds shy of sunrise. Since death is pretty meaningless in this game on normal difficulty, I was still on my way back to the hopefully burnt tree immediately after waking up. You find the road home, finally, and start plotting your way out of this nightmare. As you go, you pass several other creatures and even some familiar characters. The cripple is amongst them, dragging himself along the pavement with his forearms. Most of the other would-be escapees are cold, gray and unmoving though. As we continue forward, the road home grows darker and the creatures, frozen in time, larger and more disturbing. All manner of monstrous things must have tried to flee the woods and been frozen in place somehow before your arrival. They grow numerous enough to block sections of the road and make travel forward more difficult. Finally, we pass the last of these sad figures, and after traveling alone for a bit, reach the epilogue at last. We've managed to do the impossible. We've escaped the woods. Or have we? As we continue our trek out of the forest, things slowly start to resemble normal, everyday society. We see power lines, which we follow until the tops of buildings come into view. Then a normal street, undisturbed by questing roots. As we get a little deeper into town, we scare away a murder of crows that were being fed breadcrumbs by a completely normal, uninfected, untraumatized woman on a park bench. And they're gone. "Who's going to eat the bread now?" she chides as we pass her. Just before entering our apartment complex, we encounter a woman that's apparently our first-floor neighbor. We tell her good day, and she returns the formality naturally enough. It was at this point I realized that something was horribly wrong. I was still dressed in the same rags I'd worn throughout my filthy, bloody ordeal. Over the course of my journey, I'd become a mutant freak. A plague-infected monstrosity who'd been fleeing the worst experience of his life mere moments ago. There is no way that this woman doesn't smell me, glance up from her book, and scream as loud as she's ever screamed in her life at the horrifying creature she sees before her. One does not casually greet a mutant freak, slathered in the ichor of 1,000 greasy events. I was still under the influence of the woods somehow. My ordeal wasn't over yet. I entered the apartment complex and began searching the dark concrete hallways for confirmation of my suspicions. If one has a good eye, they can catch several little things that belie the true nature of our situation. There's a radio that, when messed with, eventually tells you to go to sleep. A neighbor has a fetus quite reminiscent of other fetal imagery found in the game, lying on the floor behind her as she opens the door to yell at you. "You're waking my kid. Go the hell away." She squawks at you before shutting the door, giving us a mere moment to notice the oddity. Eventually, we will reach our apartment, and here you have a choice. You can go to sleep, which is an ending to the game. We can allow the forest to lull us to sleep and remain there until whatever dark purpose that spurs it has run its course, or we can keep searching. We finally change out of the swamp-coated clothes we've been wearing for over a month solid, and after finding a screwdriver in a drawer, we start pulling up the floor in our apartment. As the tiles and planks come up, we notice a now overly familiar sight: roots, dirt. This is the confirmation we've been waiting for. We're still in the forest. As we proceed, we yank furniture away from walls and start tearing up the flooring beneath the TV, dresser, finally the bed. Underneath the bed is a hole leading down into the darkness. After bracing ourselves, we plunge into our final hole. Oh. And awaken naked as if reborn from the false apartment, the fraudulent reality. We find ourselves in a valley that's been completely overrun with roots and vines and other plant life. It forms the walls, the floors of the entire region. We can feel the earth pulsating underneath our feet, as if a current of electricity runs through it. Amongst these cord-like growths are other naked people, lying unconscious and clearly dreaming. Some of them speak to themselves as they writhe about on the ground, clutching their heads. We try to wake them, but it proves hopeless. After a time wandering this area, trying to wake the sleepers and listening to them mumble to themselves, we encounter something truly mystifying. Surrounded by sleeping forms, there is a swirling gray entity that seems to be a blob of pure energy. Floating inside of the blob is the abstract form of what appears to be an infant's face. This thing is known only as the Being, and it's the cause of all this bloodshed and madness. Directly before the troubles in the region began, there was an event where a huge bolt of light struck the Earth in the valley where we now stood. It was either a comet colliding with the Earth, or the being is capable of traveling through the vacuum of space in this form. Regardless of how, it came here from somewhere in the great cosmic beyond. It's an unknowable, unidentifiable entity, capable of infecting and twisting everything around it, whether that be the plants and wildlife, the geography itself, or even the fragile minds and bodies of human beings. Truly a fine example of Lovecraftian horror. And I've seen a lot of media going for exactly the strange mix of creepy and alien. We try to interact with the being by placing our hand upon it, but it's incapable of any form of normal human communication, instead filling our head with a feeling of overwhelming happiness and security. We quickly realize it's trying to lull us back to sleep, back into complacency. It wants us to return to our nice dream apartment and stop all this foolishness. If we continue to listen, we're barraged with strange sounds and vague shapes instead of the answers we seek. However, we begin to sense a presence high above us. We ask what it is, and our vision is drowned in whiteness. There is a silent grunt that becomes louder with every moment. We ask it what it wants, and you're surrounded by the coldness of the void. Its whiteness is a pure absence of color. Its grunts and hissing, the stratification and distortions of the various sounds are like the very frequency of the void, the absence of color, of life, of anything. Why does the being summon the surviving villagers to it? Does it feed off of their consciousnesses or life force somehow? They seem to lie there in this dreaming state until dying of hunger or happenstance. What does the being gain from the enclosure of this rural region and the infection and slow destruction of the people residing within the area of its dire effects? Any answers are speculation. Like any good cosmic horror, its existence defies logic or reason. It's the Elder God kind of thing that's supposed to drive you insane if you look at it or think about it for too long. There is more to be said about the possible origins of the being and the series of events that it set into motion, but first we must conclude this story. After we decide there is little to be gained but confusion from interacting with the being itself, we search around the general area a bit more and find a man we recognize. He was an outsider like you, part of the same group of people studying the events taking place in the woods. His name is Masiek, and he's clutching a large metal something wrapped with what seems to be prayer beads. We tried to take it from him, but he resists, believing it to be some lost lover or other. After a brief scuffle where we kinda sorta bust his head open, we get hold of the object and discover it to be a flamethrower? The way forward becomes clear in an instant. It's time to put an end to all of this. You launch a test projection of pure flame into Masiek, and he goes up, writhing in his final moments. Turning to the rest of the sleepers, you douse them all with liquid fire in turn, taking particular interest in torching those sleeping closest to the being itself. Soon the walls and floor catch alight and the inferno begins to properly rage around us. Paying no mind to the inevitable, we continue to fire jet after jet of flame into the sleepers, the wooden walls surrounding us, until nothing remains but the flames and ourselves. It doesn't come quick. The fire seems to slow in the last few moments as it eats up the few feet still between us. It makes us stop and think about the journey we've been on, what it's all come to, what's about to happen. It makes us consider, for the final time, the morality of our decisions. Were they good and just, or selfish and vile? Or like most things, somewhere in between. The fire finally encloses us. All goes dark, and as the inferno rages throughout the region and finally burns itself down into smoldering ash, the disturbing cycle of events that destroyed so many lives is soon concluded at last. There is a small cutscene at the end showing the fates of various characters we met throughout our experience. This changes depending on what choices you make, so I won't go into detail. The musician survived my playthrough, somehow, but most people, including the elephant family, died in the fire. Our actions, burning the being, came at a high cost. But I'd argue it's still better than letting everyone and everything in the vicinity be slowly drawn into and absorbed by the being. Over the course of however many more years, this would have continued if left to run its course. A decade or two later, would the forest have continued expanding outward, eventually infecting the planet? Or would there have been merely a desolate, blasted heath left in the location where the being had once taken its grim sustenance? After its tendrils spread out as far as they could reach, until finally drawing everything back into itself. Only then disappearing back into the darker places of an uncaring, unflinching universe. There once was a road over the hills and through the valleys that ran straight where the blasted heath is now. But people ceased to use it, and a new road was laid, curving far towards the south. Traces of the old one can still be found amidst the weeds of a returning wilderness. H.P. Lovecraft, A Color Out of Space. Aspects of this story seemed familiar to me from early on, but I had dismissed it as the general Lovecraftian influence that permeates the game. It wasn't until a bit later, during the last days in the swamp and then the ending, that it occurred to me that Darkwood may actually be based on a specific Lovecraft story, rather than on the general concept of cosmic horror and great old ones and all that. As the story progressed, this feeling of familiarity became so pronounced in my mind that I reread a story I hadn't read in years, seeking confirmation of my suspicions. After reading, I started to pick up on a whole lot of usually superficial similarities with the short story The Color Out of Space. Yes, a lot of the connections here are superficial, but there are also an awful lot of them. The Color Out of Space was written by H.P. Lovecraft in 1927 and tells the story of a family living on a small farm in an isolated valley that has a strange meteorite crash into their property one day. The word spreads, and scientists from Arkham's famous Miskatonic University come to take samples and run tests. They find the material possessing an unknown spectrum, like a color that was previously unknown. But the samples dissipate soon after having tests run on them. The farm where the meteorite landed, however, begins to drastically change, causing an ever-increasing level of dread in the family living there as the weeks turn into months and the entire ecosystem begins changing around them. There are a number of mentions of dark woods and trees growing too quickly, both luminous stone and oddly soft metal, just a ton of tiny little details that either line up perfectly with the world of Darkwood, or prove that I've been working on this video for too long and need to get about a month's worth of sleep. Probably a little therapy. Darkwood's being also came from space and landed in a valley. It's just a lot of tiny little stuff like that. Animals, both on the farm and in the general area, start to behave in strange ways, then begin changing physically. The people who live on the land start getting sick and going insane. The mother of the family is the first to fall to this infection that seems to have come from the meteorite, and has to be locked in the attic before she becomes a threat to herself and others. Kind of like the pretty lady, or the kid they toss down the well, or the people the doctor treats. All of the plant life grows out of control and turns a variety of mysterious, vivid, and unnatural colors. Later, the plants drain of all color, turning gray and crumble into dust. This is why they now refer to the area as the Blasted Heath. The family on the farm has a well that seems to have been polluted by whatever contagion has been spreading since the meteor hit. But without many other options available, they continue to drink from it. One of the children goes insane while near the well, and they lock him in the attic with the mother. The stock and poultry die, but the dogs run away. Dogs were one of the only animals that at all still resembled what they used to be in Darkwood. They went feral and some grew huge. None grew tentacles as far as I saw. The colors that the infected see is said to be cold and wet, but still burn. At one point, a thing comes out of the well and kills the father. The narrator/friend is checking in during these final moments and is the one to find the unspeakable thing the mother has transformed into up in the attic. He puts it out of its misery and summons the scientists from Miskatonic back once again in light of these recent events. They find traces of that unknown spectrum they identified before on the corpses present in the farmhouse. There is a glow that starts rising from the well where the strange gelatinous being resides. The scientists conclude that this being feeds on everything alive. Once everything has been sucked dry, the being shoots out of the well and returns to whatever void between time or space that it emerged from. Now, I'm the first to admit that this is not a one-to-one similarity. Darkwood is a completely original work of art. I just think that the color out of space was an inspiration, a jumping off point if you will. If so, it does help us understand what the being wanted the sleepers for, and why so many characters seem to hear a voice, usually her voice, calling them home. It was summoning those infected with the plague it had spread so that it could feed off of something their sleeping forms provided. This could also inform why it has an abstract, almost infantile face as well. If it's based on the creature in the well, also described as a blob of energy that drastically changes and poisons everything in the geographic area, it's a younger form of whatever it is, like a larva that's come here to feed and grow and then return to wherever its kind go to live their next life stage. The being really could be an infant, just of a species completely unknown and utterly alien to us, beyond our understanding. Instead of a color out of space, the being in Darkwood is the opposite, a gray, colorless blob that, when asked what it is, sends us a wave of pure blinding whiteness that dominates our senses. It is the lack of color, devoid of it. The final piece of the puzzle may be this, then I'll wrap this all up and call it a dreary, dreadful night. When we're burning everything down at the end, the only thing in the chamber that we can't light on fire is the being. No, it only goes up once we've turned the flames onto enough of the sleepers. Once we've set fire to its food. Whatever the being was, it was fueling itself with something, maybe even the dreams, the imagination that the sleepers provided. And once this fuel catches fire, the being goes up in flame itself. This is our final sacrifice. Us putting an end to the whole mess and forcing a conclusion on this several years long feast of souls, benefiting nothing but one ravenously hungry infant. An unspeakable, undefinable, ravenous piece of the great outside.